Fair
Okay, cool.
status.
Do you want to speak? Matt?
So
You see that picture of him and they were just
Mike,
oddly
I can't
wrong.
hear.
And what you're doing caption is just JFK and Jackie Kennedy met because JFK was using sheet metal alone and she asked for some.
wait, what?
Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome. Those of you coming in online to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And my name is Edward Schumacher Matos. I'm the director of the Edward R. Murrow Center for a Digital World. And we are so fortunate and so delighted to have with us this morning to kick off our annual conference on social media democracy, Jamie Angus, who has a very sinister title of being senior controller of overseeing all of the BBC's broadcasting in English. And prior to that, he was head of the BBC's global world group and world service, and so we saw everything that they did in more than 40 languages around the world. So we're so fortunate to have him here to start this conference about dealing with these very, very difficult issues that all of society is dealing with in all our countries. And so we'll get the point of view from somebody who's dealing with it every day, head on, and from such a prestigious organization. So Jamie, I'll turn it over to you. There'll be questions at the end. If you have any, please, for those of you online, just send them into the chat, send them to Arpitha, and she'll read them off. And we're all set to go.
Wonderful. Ed, thank you very much for that warm welcome. Well, listen, I'll dive right in, and I'm looking forward very much to hearing your questions. So the last few weeks in the UK have been dominated by a typical post-truth row. 3 weeks ago, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson accused the leader of the opposition, Sir Keir Starmer, of personally failing to prosecute the notorious paedophile Jimmy Savile when he was the head of Britain's Crown Prosecution Service. The facts do not directly support this claim, and the BBC now describes it as false in editorial content, which is a story all of itself. As ever, of course, there's nuance in the argument. Sir Keir commissioned his own review of the organisation he led in this period, and it did make criticisms around Savile's decisions, though of the institution and not the man. Several days later, following a significant backlash, not least on his own side, the Prime Minister amended his claim, though he did not apologise, and later one of his most senior aides quit in protest. For the UK media, it was quite a post-truth moment. How explicitly should media organisations judge and call out false comments made in the cut and thrust of daily politics by its own leaders? As I speak to you here in Cambridge, in the calm and benign cradle of the world's greatest democracy, it's with some relief that I say to you, thank goodness something like that could never happen in the United States. Of course, the truthiness of this particular media matter is not there. The notorious Jimmy Savile was a flamboyant DJ, television host, and charity fundraiser in his lifetime, and a figure at the heart of establishment institutions, including, shamefully, the BBC, where his prolific offending went undetected. It was only after his death that his abuse was uncovered, and in passing brought down a Director General of the BBC, who carried the can for the shelving of a long-running investigation by the BBC's own journalists into Savile's crimes, which never saw the light of day. It's no coincidence that the most toxic theme of child abuse is often at the heart of some of the more outlandish conspiracy theories which are circulating in countries, including here in the US. The last time I was in Washington, I visited the much-loved Politics and Prose bookstore, next to which sits the pizzeria at the heart of the infamous Pizzagate conspiracy, which alleges entirely falsely that a circle of child sex traffickers, sits at the heart of public life in this country. A similarly false claim gripped UK media and political circles a decade ago, when another entirely false claims of a fantasist set a series of police investigations in train which upended the lives of a number of public figures who were entirely innocent. The impact was enormous damage, not just to trust in my own profession, but also in the police, who themselves have faced a series of recent scandals in the wake of Me Too and Black Lives Matter movements, which has further eroded public confidence and led to the resignation of the head of the Metropolitan Police in London just last week. These tropes that elites are complicit in a conspiracy around the most heinous crimes imaginable are present everywhere, from the darkest corners of the dark web to the truckers' protests in Ottawa, Paris and New Zealand, to the fringes of mask mandate and vaccination protesters here in the US and London. This conference addresses media strategies for the next crisis. Today, I'd like to talk to you about the idea of a post-truth newsroom, the challenges we face, what we can do to win, and how traditional media organizations have left behind the audiences they arguably need to address the most, people who simply don't trust them at all. Last week, a mainstream UK news channel, which goes out on free-to-air television, broadcast a lengthy interview with a former girlfriend of our Prime Minister, who claimed entirely wrongly that the Prime Minister had been replaced by a doppelganger when he was hospitalised early in the pandemic. This idea was not significantly challenged on air. In 2020, another free-to-air channel in the UK broadcast an entire film from the notorious UK conspiracy theorist David Icke, denying the existence of COVID and attacking the science behind vaccination. At the same time, public regulators are openly wondering how best to engage with online content, even as regular broadcast outlets, already under their supervision, are pumping up damaging and dangerous material in linear output. But they're right to wonder about the effects of digital content, including, of course, podcasts. The Joe Rogan imbroglio at Spotify has been a perfect example of the diverging worldviews of two sets of audiences. This way, my parents, who don't know who Joe Rogan is, and my kids, who don't know who Neil Young is. For Spotify, this has been a month that's put them squarely where Facebook found themselves in the last period, trying to navigate the responsibilities of becoming content publisher. There's no question that Joe Rogan and other podcasters have found a new way of explaining complex issues in a long-form format. Guests like the podcast experience because it challenges the traditional media experience of a 3-minute TV spot against the clock. But how do interviewers like Rogan engage with voices who are often offering scientifically illiterate readings of complex public health situations? Rogan himself, in his response to the row, conceded that he himself was just a guy holding conversations, the same that happens in the real world. It's a challenge that the mainstream media needs to rise to. Rogan comes from the world of US sports. We need to find a Rogan of science, a voice which genuinely connects with audiences and has the authority and wit to challenge contentious views while drawing in new audiences. The response from trusted news broadcasters to these tides is often to say, we are doubling down on evidence-based journalism. So how do audiences engage with facts and explainers? Some of our best performing content online are our BBC reality check stories, and we've made inroads into turning this kind of content into shareable digital video through my colleague Ros Atkins and his Ros Atkins On strap, which you may have seen. Publishing these kind of reality checks is important, and newsrooms are right to do it. But evidence from our research work commissioned with the Reuters Institute shows that explainers and reality checks only ever reach a tiny fraction of the audiences who see an original piece of disinformation. The Reuters team further found that the popular measure of labeling disputed stories on tech platforms had no statistically discernible effect in some key markets. News publishers have rightly focused on first-person stories as a priority. First-person-led digital content in particular is striking and sticky. It gets attention and retains it for long read or view times. It's also a powerful tool for diversity, and it allows voices to be heard, which are often suppressed or do not enjoy privileged access to the news media. But the pivot to video consumption and its first-person-led narratives surely comes with a risk attached. These stories raise up the experience of one individual above everything, and they can have little space for explanation and context. They are poor vehicles for balance and impartiality, where they present only one person's lived experience. This focus on first-person narratives is driving a lack of trust in news. We see across the anti-vax movement, for example, a focus on first-person views over the mass of scientific evidence. How often do you hear people say, "I just don't think this is right for me personally," as if this was the beginning and the end of the argument? This week, the BBC secured an exclusive interview with Novak Djokovic, where he made exactly this kind of argument. He accepts the science behind vaccination, but doesn't feel it's right for him personally. We were right to broadcast it, and we made sure that we included the relevant scientific evidence about the safety of vaccines alongside his views. But over time, news publishers are going to have to think about the mix of first-person testimony and fact-based explainers, and do more to ensure that audiences engage with both. Let's look at another growing area where the ideas of trust and transparency intersect for news publishers. As every journalist's inbox will attest, there is booming interest in cryptocurrencies and blockchain technologies. And slowly but surely, established news media are starting to look at ways to incorporate these emerging technologies into their work. So far, the world of NFTs seems to be based mainly on owning tokens of cartoon chimps. But this could change quickly. No lesser organization than the AP is now selling NFTs of its most famous photo images, and CNN are selling tokens of its news footage. Journalism producers, ever alive to potential new streams of revenue, will inevitably now be looking at the space. As someone who's too old now to understand most of what happens on TikTok, you'd expect my views on this to reflect the skepticism most journalists share. The commentator Stephen Deal has judged the blockchain world in this way: a one-trick pony whose only application is creating censorship-resistant crypto investment schemes, an invention whose negative externalities and capacity for harm vastly outweigh any possible uses. Tell us what you really think, Stephen. And it's right that we're worrying a lot about the environmental impact, in particular of some cryptocurrencies, inevitable for news organizations who make much of their own commitment to sustainability and climate change. But let's dig a little deeper and ask whether blockchain and crypto has potential beneficial uses to news publishers, and in what circumstances. Or, as my esteemed BBC colleague Bill Thompson put it, just as in the early days of the unreliable dial-up internet or insecure personal computing, it's reasonable to ask, what would we do with this stuff if it actually worked? The immutable nature of blockchain is fascinating for those that worry about censorship and suppression of free publication of news content. The downsides are obvious. Content could not be amended, and there are legitimate reasons to take down or amend what has already been published. But approach this question from the perspective of journalists in countries who suppress press freedom, and there are some intriguing possibilities. Countries where the whole system, from advertising, the banking system, and state regulation, is turned to suppressing free journalism. Countries where audiences have lost trust in providers who operate within state structures, knowing the compromises that entails. Countries like the Philippines, where the Fletcher School alumna and Nobel Prize winner Maria Ressa continues her fight for independent journalism. In those circumstances, crypto funding, which can circumvent state control, looks like a more attractive option. A system of crypto micropayments, for example, to allow users to fund independent journalism without fear of detection. Using blockchain technology to publish information that cannot simply be suppressed, altered, or blocked. Using the same technologies to get past states that jam linear broadcasting services. This is why the BBC publishes its own news website on the Tor web, the unblockable dark web. Let's be honest, it's not a world we naturally find ourselves in, but for audiences in Iran or Russia or China, it can make the difference between free access to news or none. These are intriguing areas, and they probably have a wider benefit than a fire sale of NFTs to fund journalism in countries where other options are easily available. Huge challenges remain, not least that there is no clear legal framework that protects IP and publishers' rights in this space, and many of these technologies are in an ungoverned space outside of the law. But for news providers like the BBC, it could come down to a more simple question. Should we break the law in countries where independent journalism is effectively illegal? I'd like to recommend my BBC colleague Gabriel Gatehouse's podcast called The Coming Storm. In it, he analyses the rise of post-truth conspiracies in the US, a process that arguably began with the anti-Clinton tropes of the early internet chat rooms and culminates in the events of January the 6th last year and a conspiracy around QAnon. But like the best journalism, Gabriel asks some really uncomfortable questions of the mainstream media. For example, he contends that mainstream media outlets, including some of the US's biggest media brands, fails to investigate significant and legitimate political concerns about the Clintons in the early 90s, driving those stories to a fringe element of online bloggers and cranks. Remember Hillary Clinton describing these elements as a vast right-wing conspiracy? Arguably, the stories that metastasized into the founding myths of the alt-right could and should have been reported out by responsible media outlets many years before, reducing their potency. The conspiracies of QAnon captured the imagination of millions of Americans. And one observation that really struck me was that Q didn't just publish fake stories. Instead, he engaged millions in solving problems, doing their own research, following clues, engaging active, though misguided citizens. This has been a feature of a lot of the damaging conspiracies and lies that have been shared by millions. People damaging democracy, killing citizens from COVID because they did their own research. We shouldn't brush this aside. There are things the media can learn from so-called bad actors to strengthen our response. The need to engage audiences, as well as sharing more of our journalism with our audiences. Transparency about how we do our research, sharing our workings, and admitting our mistakes, not just presenting facts. Some of our really high-impact digital journalism is already there, using open source intelligence technology, or OSINT. Africa Eye, our African investigation strand, BBC Arabic, now more investment is going there, showing how we do our work, working with communities of online geeks as well as journalists. They are incredible investigations which we've carried out in part with external organisations like Bellingcat. And so they are collaborative and open, but they also demonstrate our workings and therefore inspire trust. And we should ask ourselves honestly whether there are legitimate areas of inquiry which the media closed itself off from in the teeth of the pandemic threat, which really should have had more attention. I have two examples to open for discussion today. One is China's role in the origins and early months of the COVID outbreak. Recently, much good work has been done sorting fact from rumour in light of the Biden administration's deep dive into the so-called lab leak theory in 2021. But did the media really reflect on this story with us as open a mind in 2020 as we should have, when legitimate questions about China's transparency were often deflected by a public health establishment keen to focus public discourse on prevention measures around masks and vaccination? And secondly, I wonder whether the trade-off debates between personal freedom of choice and the need to maintain public safety were explicitly enough explored in the first year of the pandemic. Let's return for a moment to Novak Djokovic. Here is someone who explicitly rejects vaccines conspiracy theories, but is digging in on a point about personal choice. Did these kinds of arguments get enough dispassionate consideration at a time when we were understandably focused on tackling a terrifying global pandemic? The result was undoubtedly that some biddable vaccine skeptics were driven off into a fringe world of cranks and conspiracists, one that set out to create an alternative media based on alternative facts. We have to do better next time. We need to find a space where those with legitimate concerns are welcomed into the public square rather than being shut down. I keep returning to this thought of a biddable audience, that there is a significant chunk of the audiences we have lost off the back of the pandemic, possibly forever, who could have been kept in a fact-based environment had we done things differently. The BBC's response as a post-truth newsroom has been to invest in new analysis of disinformation and new services for our future audiences. In recent years, we have scaled up hugely our counter-disinformation teams. We analyse patterns of disinformation around big stories, including key global elections or the crisis in Ukraine. We run a real-time alert system in collaboration with other news publishers and tech platforms as part of the Trusted News initiative to trigger warnings when content threatens life, democracy, or the safety of journalists. And we've expanded our work for young audiences who will make up the response to the next global crisis. We've developed a strand of digital and linear programming, My World, for secondary school age audiences, which focuses on explaining global crises and contested issues for audiences who don't necessarily understand the values of media literacy. Working with partners including Microsoft Education and our co-producer Angelina Jolie, we are pushing the boundaries of how to get this material direct to audiences who need it. In a series of BBC-produced videos on her Instagram account, which regularly reaches over 3 million users, Angelina has helped to explain the crisis for girls living in fear and in Afghanistan. Not enough is being done for this key audience segment, and I welcome any help you can give us in sustaining this important work. In summary, my instincts as a journalist have always been to double down on what I know or think I can prove, and to entreat others to join us in a world where facts and evidence reign supreme. But I wonder whether this is enough anymore. In my remarks today, I've tried to set out a number of areas where audiences are asking us really awkward questions and telling us messages we'd ideally prefer not to hear. When we assess what we've learned from the pandemic experience of the last 2 years and the wider crisis for democracy in the last decade, we can't simply come back with the same set of answers, with the certainty that we've been right all along. We have to show that we've learned from the way powerful stories are being disseminated by people with malign motives. Trusted media organisations need to change the way they do their own storytelling and to change the tone when addressing the section of the audience who are biddable, who can be kept in a fact-based universe. Newsrooms tend to obsess about young audiences, believing that losing that future pipeline is an existential threat. But the greater threat is now surely losing a group of people who will no longer trust any major media organisation, now or in the future. And we need to demonstrate greater reflectiveness in our response to them. So, as I head back to the UK in March, I'll be pondering some key questions informed by spending time in the US, the country I dearly love. For example, how is it possible that you can buy a military assault weapon in parts of this country, but not park facing the wrong way in the street? What do Fahrenheit temperatures mean? Why is Eileen Gu competing for China? And crucially, why is the World Series only played in America? These are undoubtedly the great questions of our times. But alongside them, do give me cause to reflect on the next great global crisis. What role should the media play? What have we done right so far? And where could we have done better? I can't wait to hear the ideas from today's session, and I look forward to making my own contribution. Thanks very much.
Jamie's agreed to take questions first from the audience, but also from people coming in virtually, so please send them in. Who would like to?
Someone be brave. It's always the worst thing going for us. Well done. Well done.
I would love to know, you mentioned quite a few really poignant examples of cause for more attention, cause for more dedicated concerted efforts. I would love to know your thoughts on Taiwan's digital ministry and how Audrey Tang is doing in terms of incorporating that media literacy. There's been a lot of critiques as media literacy is something as a reactive solution,
right.
But it seems to me she's done quite a good job, especially looking at PRC-driven disinformation efforts and the lack of success during the re-election. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, thank you. I'm not totally familiar with the Taiwanese example, so it was really interesting that you raised it. I'll try and inform myself a bit better about it. I mean, I think you're right that when you describe media literacy as a reactive solution, that's true and not true, in the sense that I think that building a global framework for introducing media literacy into primary and secondary education is going to be a generational task. It's not something we're going to fix through a year or two of civics classes here and there, or mainly in developed countries in the West or North America. It's going to take a generation for governments around the world to understand that a lack of media literacy amongst their audiences is genuinely a destabilizing force in their own societies. And we've seen examples of that everywhere from the United States to the Middle East to Hong Kong, or Ukraine and Russia now, an inability to understand what you're being told by whom and how you might want to apply critical thought to that. And some of the tools for doing that, particularly in the digital and social media space, is absolutely essential to anchoring the safety and stability of societies. So I think it's a really interesting area. We've switched quite a lot of investment in the BBC World Service actually to address media literacy. We've been doing some interesting trial programs in India and also in some East African countries, often in partnership with tech platforms who are quite interested in kind of funding teaching materials so that educators have sort of suitable material to put into schools to start to address this topic. But actually, in truth, I don't think a broadcaster can ever really be the prime mover in responding to this crisis. It has to be a big coalition of governments, education departments, legislators, news broadcasters, tech platform. It requires this kind of full spectrum response, and it's going to take a generation to fix.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for your remarks. I'm struck by your inclusion of the blockchain and NFTs being part of your what you call the post-truth newsroom. Blockchain is just about as old as Facebook. So I am struck by a lot of the conversation about its newness and how maybe it's just getting started and we need to know where it's going, but it's over a decade old now, and its usefulness is still not clear.
Yes.
Do you feel, how much is like FOMO, fear of missing out,
Yes.
part of this conversation, and how much is this actually going to become part of your newsroom?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. It's a good question, and it's why I've sort of slightly made myself discuss it a bit today, because I think my natural instincts are just like, this doesn't have a relevance. It's sort of, sorcery, and it doesn't have like a legitimate real world application, not least because there are so many examples of it being used for criminal activity and so on and so forth. But I suppose the reason I put the section in was I was just trying to ask myself, are there journalism circumstances which are appropriate to the anonymity and flexibility and ability to operate in our state-controlled banking system in particular that cryptocurrencies offer? And I think the answer is yes. I'm not sure whether that will turn into a viable business model or anything like. I guess I'm asking myself that it's not enough for journalists like me to sort of follow our natural inclinations and just say this is all witchcraft. That has no legitimate applications. You're right to pull me up, of course, that this has been around for quite a long time. But I suppose what I'm really struck by the last couple of times I've been in the US is the sort of tidal wave of investment money going into crypto, blockchain, NFT related projects. Where is that? Is it motivated by FOMO, or is it motivated by a genuine sense that what I quoted my colleague in the piece is just like, what if they're right, and what if there is something here, but like other parts of the digital revolution, it takes 5 to 10 years to play out from concept to reality. So I guess I completely share your reservations and skepticism. I'm very struck that there are a number of parts of the world, particularly where the BBC operates, and we don't operate, we focus our resources, for example, on reaching audiences in Iran, trying to reach audiences in China, reaching audiences in Myanmar. And these are countries that are prepared to use the whole full spectrum of state resources to suppress legitimate journalism. And therefore, it's probably incumbent on journalism organisations to ask whether they can circumvent those, even if, like, being on Tor web, on the dark web, you don't feel very comfortable with it. Good question there.
I'd like to ask about fragments of media, especially social media. Nowadays, people do not rely on only traditional media like BBC. They see news through Twitter or YouTube, especially the latter. The users, audience, see the social media because they can only consume the news they only want to see. So, so algorithm and AI of YouTube or social media let the users focus on their favorite news only, no matter what the news contents are reliable or not. So this can spread misinformation more to the world. So about this situation, what should the traditional mass media should do? So they also need to spread the trustworthy news to the world.
Thank you. Well, what an excellent question, and it's a huge question that we're asking ourselves all the time. What you're saying is that a big international media organisation like the BBC is in a bit of a sort of fork of the ways, which is that we're probably big enough to ask people to come onto our own platform, where we kind of can curate what people see and make sure that stories are appropriately ordered, and that we can offer context around stories and so on. But at the same time, there's a huge amount of reach to be. Most people will never come to the BBC News website because we're just never the kind of primary operator in the market. So they're much more likely to see BBC News content. It's exactly the way that you describe in a social feed. And the social feed is controlled by an algorithm. And it's very clear that those algorithms are unaccountable, unreliable, and they don't respond to democratic or societal pressures or regulation particularly. They just do what they do. And that has benefits as well as risks. The benefits are that it massively widens the distribution of quality news. So quality news providers can reach audiences that they never would have reached before. So if you go out into the street and ask 10 people, are you interested? Ask 100 people, are you interested in international news from the BBC? Probably about 40 of them would say yes, and about 60 of them would say no. But social media will probably throw up BBC News content into the social media feeds of some of the 60%, and some of them will read it, and some of them will be interested. So that's the kind of upside of social media distribution. The downsides are exactly as you've laid out, that they make no qualitative assessment of what's good quality and what's not. And they're very, as we discovered in 2016 in this country, they're very open to abuse by sophisticated state actors or non-state actors. And that is something that, again, requires a kind of complex regulatory and industry-wide response. It requires tech platforms to work with news providers like the BBC's Trusted News Initiative that I alluded to in the speech. But it also clearly is the subject of huge regulatory interest in the United States. So, the kind of what is the regulatory response in this country to what happened in 2016 and what happened in January 6 last year is clearly a really pressing issue for US regulators, and a very pressing issue for tech platforms who are trying to sort of make sure that they get the answer that they want rather than the answer that legislators want. So yeah, it's as relevant a question as it was when we first started thinking about it 6-7 years ago, when social media distribution became clear what a huge opportunity and threat it was. Question.
I think we can take one last question online.
Yeah, sure.
We have a question about your view on making the public square a more welcoming space for views that could be different from ours, instead of pushing those opinions to differences, and what we can do as individuals to foster dialogue. Yeah, so this is really interesting. A really interesting question. We've been doing some work in the BBC World Service. One of my colleagues has been working on a concept called deep listening, which is about how do you get people who fundamentally disagree to actually spend time with each other and listen without condemning or shutting down. And it's often listening to concepts that you not only disagree with, but you find kind of quite offensive. And it's a sort of sensitive but interesting area.
that I think we're learning a bit from in terms of how we do our public-facing journalism, because I think we increasingly need to have journalism that brings people together rather than drives them apart, and also acknowledges that people who disagree fundamentally with each other can coexist in a public square. And I think that's what's been lost in many countries, and it's nowhere more obvious than it is here in the US, which is a great concern to, I'm sure, to you and certainly to people like me who love the United States and love spending time here, that there is sort of unwillingness to even share a sort of space with people who you fundamentally disagree with. And you'd rather just got to carve out your own dedicated space where you will only encounter people who share the same worldview as you. Now, in recent, in previous years, things like public media offered a really valuable opportunity because they were non-commercially funded. They were able to kind of encompass broader social purposes like this. And certainly one of the reasons people like me wanted to spend half a career working for a public broadcaster was that we believed that there was a value in allowing people to come together and find that there was more that united them than divided them. But I think that model's really started to break down in recent years. And I think in answer to the question, the media are only ever going to be part of the solution. They're probably part of the problem and part of the solution, but it's got to be a much wider society, technology, and legislative response to bring those our societies back together again. Sorry, this is an incredibly vague answer. I'm trying to think of something punchy to say. It's such a good question. I can take another one.
Yes, we can,
what time are we going?
yes.
Go ahead.
So two of the most well-known journalists that I can think of who deal specifically with the fringes of conspiracy theories, John Ronson and Louis Theroux, both British, and both have kind of specialized in US conspiracy theories, specifically in broadcasting them, like especially Louis Theroux to mostly a British market. Would you say that now, though, that kind of the wackiness has spread to other countries, including UK, do you think that there's still an appetite from the UK public to kind of watch the glitches in the matrix here in the US, or is it something that's being felt now more at home? Like, has these kind of crazy ideas, sorry, not crazy ideas, but have these very fringe ideas kind of spread more to other countries?
Yeah, so that's such a great question. Interestingly, I heard Louis Theroux being interviewed about exactly this on the BBC when the new series came out, and they asked him, like, are you thinking completely differently about your responsibilities in this series than you were when you first did What's in Weird Weekends, 20 years ago, where he first did this kind of look at this crazy American style of journalism. And also, is it appropriate to do at all? Because there's an editorial question about, like, if you do a big profile on the Westboro Baptist Church, which is one that you did like 15, 20 years ago, are you just raising that up to a status that it doesn't deserve? And he very interestingly said that it's true that they just didn't really think about that 20 years ago, because when they were first making the series, the way he puts it, the idea that doing a thing about Minutemen in Nebraska would have an impact on the lives of British Fuhrer in Tunbridge Wells was just like, you couldn't even imagine how that would happen. And I think Louis acknowledged that now you can absolutely see, when I reference the truckers dispute, something that's kind of gone from being a regional Canadian trade dispute to being another sort of global gilet jaune type phenomenon. You can see really clearly what sensitivities are and what your responsibilities as a journalist are to not inappropriately raise stuff up. And if you are going to raise it up, to really challenge it. And what does editorial challenge mean if you're challenging the views of flat earthers? Like, some of this stuff has a degree, as I said in the speech, some of this stuff has enough legitimacy and fact in it that it's worth teasing it apart. But if you've got a bunch of people who say Hillary Clinton-led paedophile cabal has taken over the US government, it's like there's no legitimate case to try and analyse that because it is factually untrue. And these are the kind of editorial dilemmas that we're now facing in newsrooms every day, I think. Not just Louis, actually for news providers as well. Good question.
I think that's my question, because the next panel is in a few minutes.
Okay. Can I just ask one question before we end it then? so many students end up accusing BBC and the mainstream news media of no backbone, of trying to pursue this, objectivity on the one hand, on the other hand. Why aren't you just coming right out and saying some of these things are lies? We're part of the problem because we don't.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's exactly the right question, Ed, and it's kind of what I'm trying to get to in the speech, really, which is that that's our natural inclination as journalists, is to say you're wrong and these are lies, and you have to immediately come over to our way of thinking or go away. And I guess I'm asking that I'm not sure that's been a little counterproductive. I think we need to just allow audiences space to express their reservations about things, and then try and put some facts back into the discussion. And it makes us feel better as journalists to say, I'm simply going to call this out and I'm not going to engage with it. It makes us all feel good about ourselves, but I'm arguing, I guess, whether that is necessarily in the longer term interests of societies, because it can make journalists and journalism seem awfully pompous, if I might say, that we're just getting this back from audiences that you think you know everything and you're just kind of condemning me when I've got a question about vaccination safety for pregnant women based on some stuff I read on Facebook, and rather than telling me that I'm part of the problem, maybe you'd just like to answer my concerns, if I could give that kind of example. So yeah, it's a really, we're asking ourselves these questions every day in newsrooms, and I'm not sure we're getting the answers right.
Wonderful. Well, listen, this has been fascinating, and we could talk about some of these issues all day. Really appreciate this. Thank you so much for coming.
No, thank you for having me.